Before today's video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the latest videos. If you want to see a case or topic covered by Paranormally Listed, then go to criminallylisted.com and fill out the questionnaire under the Suggest a Case tab. Number 3. Violet Jessup. In 1887, Violet Jessup was born to Irish immigrants in Argentina. At a young age, she contracted tuberculosis, also known as TB, and was given little time to live. But miraculously, Jessup would go on to live a long and interesting life and was bestowed with the nickname Miss Unsinkable. In the 19th century, TB killed 1 in 4 people in Europe and North America, so to survive it was a great feat. After her father's passing, Violet's mother moved the family back to the United Kingdom. Her mother then started working on a ship for the Royal Mail Line. Violet was sent to a convent school. During this time, Violet's mother started suffering from health problems and couldn't work. As the oldest of 6 children, Violet had to give up the convent school and became a stewardess for the Royal Mail Line. Soon after, she reluctantly started working for the White Star Line. She didn't want to work for the White Star Line because she didn't like the idea of traveling over the North Atlantic due to weather conditions. There were also rumors that the passengers on that run were overly demanding. During Violet's time with the White Star Line, she sailed on many ships, including the Majestic, the Adriatic, and the Oceanic. In 1911, she boarded the RMS Olympic, giving Violet her first chance to be credited as Miss Unsinkable. The White Star Line decided to make 2 sister ships known more for comfort than speed. One was the RMS Olympic, and the other was the most famous ship in the world, the RMS Titanic. On September 20th, 1911, during the ship's 5th voyage, the Olympic was traveling through the Solent, a strait between the Isle of Wight and Great Britain. On that voyage through the Solent, the Olympic was commanded by Captain Edward Smith. The ship had to make an S-turn, which is supposed to allow the oncoming British cruiser, the HMS Hawke, to run parallel with the Olympic. Unaware of how wide the Olympic was turning, the HMS Hawke collided with the starboard side close to the stern. Luckily for everyone involved in the collision, the Hawke's bow was designed for ramming other ships. On the Olympic, it created 2 large holes above and below the waterline, and the watertight compartments held the flooding waters. The propeller shaft was also twisted in the collision. Although having 2 major holes, the Olympic was able to float with a slight tilt to the stern. It managed to return to Southampton on its own. The HMS Hawke suffered severe damage to its bow and it was close to capsizing. But it made it back to port and it was repaired. It would go on to serve for another 3 years until she was sunk in October 1914. Violet was on board the Olympic during the collision. But luckily, Violet and no one else on the ship was injured or killed because they were enjoying the ship's amenities at the time of impact. The RMS Olympic needed 6 weeks to be repaired, so Violet was out of work and needed another job. A friend persuaded her to join the crew of the RMS Titanic. 24-year-old Violet set sail on April 10, 1912, serving on the maiden voyage as a first-class stewardess on the RMS Titanic. As we all know, the RMS Titanic, commanded by Captain Edward Smith, sailed for 4 days over the Atlantic Ocean. Then, just before midnight on April 14th, the unsinkable ship hit an iceberg. Soon afterward, the Titanic said it would call for help because they were sinking. When the ship collided with an iceberg, Violet and most people on board were settling in for the night. Violet was lying in her bunk in a comfortable, drowsy state. She was abruptly awoken to the sound of the collision and she was ordered to get on deck. While the boat sank, she was told to keep passengers calm while crews loaded lifeboats. She was then placed on Lifeboat 16. Just before she was lowered to the freezing waters, she was handed a baby to take care of. The RMS Titanic sank 2 hours and 40 minutes after it collided with the iceberg. The final resting spot is at the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean on the coast of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. With 2,224 on board, just over 700 people would see the RMS Carpathia, which arrived 3.5 hours later. Having survived her second maritime disaster, Violet, still with baby in hand, boarded the ship. While on the Carpathia, the child's mother grabbed the baby from Violet's arm and ran off crying. Perhaps after surviving 2 disasters on the water, one would want to stay on land for the rest of their life. But not Violet Jessup. She rejoined the RMS Olympic after it was fixed. She served on the ship for another 2 years until war broke out in Europe. Violet then decided it was time to focus being on land. She trained as a voluntary aid detachment nurse for the British Red Cross. But, as luck would have it, she was sent back to the ocean. In 1916, Violet was aboard the HMHS Britannic. She was the younger sister ship of the Olympic and the Titanic, and the final of the 3 White Star Line's transatlantic passenger liners. A year before, in 1915, the ship was converted to a hospital ship to help in the war efforts. Leaving Southampton on November 12, 1916, the Britannic was headed to pick up more wounded in the Mediterranean Sea. With weather conditions delaying the ship, the Britannic eventually reached the Key Channel, a passageway in the Greek islands. On the morning of November 21, 1916, the ship was rocked by a loud explosion. The Britannic had hit a mine that was planted by a German SMU-73 almost a month earlier. When the explosion happened, most people were eating breakfast in the dining room. Doctors and nurses immediately went to their posts, but others on the boat thought that they hit a small ship. What they didn't know was that the starboard side had started filling up with water. Having taken too much damage to the watertight compartments, the ship started to list on the starboard side. With the ship sinking fast, the captain could see the Green Island Key and decided to navigate the ship, hoping to beach the damaged vessel. Having the Britannic tilt to the starboard side, the captain ordered the ship to run at a higher speed. At this time, the crew was getting lifeboats ready, but they did not receive orders to lower them. As the captain was trying to get the boat to land, his maneuvers caused the ship to list even more. Fearing the ship's list would be too great, the crew decided to lower lifeboats without order. As the ship tilted towards the starboard side, the now sinking ship's propellers were on the port side and had become partly surfaced. They sucked in 2 lifeboats and minced everyone and everything on board. Seeing the islands as no longer a hope, the captain ordered the engines to be stopped and ordered everyone to abandon ship. 35 lifeboats successfully launched as the Britannic capsized on the starboard side. Minutes later, the ship's stern started to rise to the sky and the propellers rose out of the water. Although the propellers had been turned off, the propellers continued to spin and sucked in lifeboats as the stern continued to rise. Violet was on one of these lifeboats and had to jump off. Unfortunately, she suffered a terrible head injury, but she would survive. At 9:07 a.m., the HMHS Britannic dropped below the waves and became the largest ship lost in the First World War. Out of the 1,066 passengers, miraculously, only 30 men perished. Violet had now become a 3-time survivor of ship disasters, all before the age of 30. Amazingly, Violet, now called Miss Unsinkable, continued to work for the White Star Line. She would join the Red Star Line and then later the Royal Mail Line. In 1950, she retired from the voyages and settled in a village in Suffolk, England. Years after retiring, on a stormy night, Violet received a strange phone call from an anonymous caller. The person asked Violet if she had saved a baby the night the Titanic sank. She responded, yes. The caller said, "I was that baby," then laughed and hung up. When Violet told the story to her friend and biographer, John Maxstone Graham, he said it was probably a child joking with her. But she told Maxstone Graham that she had never told anyone about the baby she had saved. According to official records, the only baby on Lifeboat 16 was a sad Thomas. It's unknown if he made the phone call. Violet ended up living a long life. In 1971, at the age of 83, Violet Jessup passed away from congestive heart failure. Number 2. Adrian Carton de Wiart. We all know that war is hell, but for Adrian Carton de Wiart's experience World War I, he wrote, "Frankly, I enjoyed the war." That might sound like the words of a psychopath, but that is coming from someone who was shot 7 times, lost his left eye, survived not 1, but 2 plane crashes, escaped a prison of war camp by tunneling out, and tore his fingers off because the doctor refused to remove them. But World War I is not where Carton de Wiart's amazing story begins. In 1899, 2 Boer republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State, were at war with the British Empire. The conflict is commonly known as the Second Boer War. The main reason for the war was the discovery of gold on the Boers' land. The discovery led to an influx of British citizens immigrating to the area, and they tried to project their politics and ideologies on the native people. Ultimately, war broke out, and that's when 19-year-old Adrian Carton de Wiart got his first taste of combat. Carton de Wiart was deployed with the Middlesex Yeomanry, a volunteer cavalry regiment of the British Army, and he was sent to what is today South Africa. During a battle, Carton de Wiart was shot in the stomach and the groin. Because of his injuries, he was sent back to England, and not to a hero's welcome, but to an angry father. His father had no idea he left college to join the British Army. Carton de Wiart had used a fake name, Trooper Carton, and claimed he was 25 when he enlisted in the army. But with his father's blessing, Carton de Wiart was allowed to stay in the army, and he would see military action in South Africa again. On July 16, 1904, he was promoted to supernumerary lieutenant and appointed aide-de-camp to the commander-in-chief. Carton de Wiart called the 10 years before World War I his heydays, and he focused on physical fitness and playing polo. Following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, Europe erupted into a 4-year war, later known as World War I. Carton de Wiart was sent to a lower-tier war in which the British Army assisted the Ethiopians and Italian forces. While deploying the Somaliland campaign, Carton de Wiart was shot twice, once in the arm and once in the face. The shot that hit Carton de Wiart in the face destroyed his left eye and part of his ear. Doctors could not save his eye, so they sent him back to England. This turned out to be lucky for Carton de Wiart, but we use the term lucky very loosely, because he was able to fight in Europe where the real action was happening. After recovering and fitted with a glass eye, he was declared medically cleared for service. After being cleared, he threw his glass eye out the window of his taxi and put on an eye patch. The eye patch would later become part of his signature look. Adrian Carton de Wiart was sent to the Western Front in 1915 and participated in the Second Battle of Ypres. The German army launched an artillery barrage, and his left hand was shattered. As the doctors tried to save his hand, he ripped 2 fingers off because they refused to amputate them. Later that year, doctors amputated the whole hand. Even after all those injuries, including losing his left eye and hand, he was medically cleared to return to war. In 1916, Carton de Wiart was promoted to commander of the 8th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Although he was a commander, that didn't stop him from getting his one good hand dirty. Soldiers recounted that during the Battle of Somme, Carton de Wiart was in the trenches with them, pulling grenade pins with his teeth and throwing the grenades with his good hand at the enemy. His efforts inspired awe in his soldiers, and he received the Victoria Cross. After World War I, Adrian Carton de Wiart was sent to Poland to be the second in command of the British Poland military mission. In 1919, he survived a plane crash which resulted in a short captivity in Lithuania. On August 20th, he was on an observation train. Suddenly, the train was hijacked by a group of Cossacks, which, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, are people dwelling in the northern hinterlands of the Black and Caspian Seas. Carton de Wiart was only armed with a revolver, but he attempted to stop the hijacking. While fighting with the hijackers, Carton de Wiart fell off the train and onto the tracks. But he managed to jump back onto the moving train and handle the rest of the hijackers. Carton de Wiart then settled in Poland and planned to live a quiet civilian life. But then, on September 1st, 1939, on orders of the Fuhrer of Germany, Adolf Hitler, Nazi forces invaded Poland. Not caring for des Nazis, Adrian Carton de Wiart regained his position in the British Army and provided military advice in Poland. Then, acting as Major General, he led a campaign in Norway where a seaplane was forced to land due to a German attack. Then he was posted to Northern Ireland to command the 61st Division. As Hitler was preparing to invade Yugoslavia in 1941, Carton de Wiart was appointed Major General of the British Yugoslavian military mission. Leaving Malta and heading to Cairo, Egypt, the plane he was flying in had double engine failure. The plane crashed about a mile off the coast of Italian-controlled Libya. Carton de Wiart was knocked out but regained consciousness when cold water flooded the plane. Having no other options, Carton de Wiart and the rest of the crew swam away from the sinking plane towards land. Once on shore, he was taken as a prisoner of war. Not wanting to spend much time there, he and 3 other prisoners attempted to escape 5 times. He finally escaped through a tunnel that took him 7 months to dig. For 18 days, the one-eyed, one-handed, seemingly death-proof Englishman disguised himself as an Italian. But then he was finally recaptured. Negotiations led to him being released. No one would have faulted Carton de Wiart for retiring, but that wasn't in the cards for him. Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent him to China to be the government's military representative. In October 1947, Adrian Carton de Wiart finally retired from the British Army with the honorary ranking of Lieutenant General. He wrote an autobiography, Happy Odyssey, the memoirs of Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart. In his autobiography, he wrote, "Governments may think and say as they like, but force cannot be eliminated, and it is the only real and unanswerable power. We are told that the pen is mightier than the sword, but I know which of these weapons I would choose." Having survived 3 wars and all his injuries, Adrian Carton de Wiart was called the Unkillable Soldier. That wasn't the end of his injuries. One day, at the age of 67, he fell down a flight of stairs. He knocked himself out and broke his back. While recovering, doctors removed large amounts of shrapnel from his war-ravaged body. Death finally came for Adrian Carton Wiart on June 5, 1963. He was 83 years old. Number 1. Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Unlike the other people on this list, Tsutomu Yamaguchi did not seek battle, nor did he have a risky job on the water. He worked for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries as an engineer for oil tankers. However, the war would find him. Born in March 1916 in Japan, he lived an uneventful life until he was 29. He was on a 3-month business trip and he was preparing to leave back home on his last day. He went to the shipyard for the last time to inspect the new tanker they had spent the summer working on. Then they saw an aircraft flying overhead. It was an American B-29 bomber. The plane released a small object connected to a parachute. While he watched the object fall to the ground, a flash of light filled the sky. As if hit by a tornado, Yamaguchi flew into a nearby potato patch. Now blinded, his eardrum ruptured, and with serious burns to his left side, he crawled to a shelter. At the shelter, he regained his vision. After a brief rest, he went looking for his colleagues. They luckily survived, and they had spent the night in an air raid shelter. Did I mention the date? You probably already guessed, but it was August 6, 1945. A few years earlier, early on the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii. 2,403 U.S. personnel died that day. The following day, the United States entered the Second World War and declared war on Japan. With the war raging in Europe, the U.S. joined forces with the Allied powers, which included Great Britain, the Soviet Union, Canada, Australia, France, amongst others. 4 years later, the war turned in favor of the Allies. They had pushed back the German forces and reclaimed countries the Nazis had conquered. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler did something he should have done after he failed being an artist. He took his own life. This effectively ended the war in Europe. However, the United States was still in battle in the Pacific with the Japanese. The USA had been relentless in their bombing of Japan. Many buildings in Tokyo were made from wood. On March 9th and 10th, American forces dropped firebombs on central Tokyo. Over 100,000 people were killed and 1 million were left homeless. It was the most destructive bombing raid in history. Yet, the Japanese had not surrendered. Not wanting the war to continue, President Harry S. Truman decided to unleash a new bomb with destructive capabilities the world had never seen: the atom bomb. The plan was to drop 2 bombs on Japanese cities. Unfortunately, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was spending his last day in Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the Enola Gay bomber dropped the Little Boy bomb on Hiroshima, killing 66,000 people and injuring 69,000. Yamaguchi was only 3 kilometers from ground zero. After surviving the first attack with an atomic bomb, Yamaguchi went home. He even reported for work 3 days later. The U.S. was planning on dropping a second bomb on the city of Kokura. 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima on August 9, 1945, bomber plane Boxcar was flying to Kokura. But then the weather started to change, and clouds of smoke from a previous air raid filled the sky, blanketing the city. Unable to clearly see the city, the crew of the boxcar decided to move on to the next choice, Nagasaki, the hometown of Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Heavily bandaged, Yamaguchi went back to work, telling his experience in Hiroshima to his supervisor. At 11 a.m., boxcar dropped the Fat Man bomb on Nagasaki. Once again, Yamaguchi was 3 kilometers from ground zero. He saw another intense flash of light. Perhaps relying on his survival instincts, he dropped to the floor as the windows around him shattered. All his bandages were blown off, and he received another surge of radiation. Amazingly, having survived his second atomic bomb blast, Yamaguchi escaped relatively unharmed. Although the Fat Man was more powerful than the little boy, Nagasaki's hilly landscape helped lower the bomb's impact. 39,000 people were killed and 2,500 were injured. Yamaguchi gathered his bearings and left for work to go home to find out what had happened to his wife and son. When he reached the street, he found his house had been destroyed and he did not see his family. He feared that they had been killed in the explosion. But it turned out that his family had survived with minor injuries, and it was because Yamaguchi had survived the bombing of Hiroshima. Just before the bomb was dropped, his wife and son had gone out to get him some burn ointment. When the bomb exploded, they found a tunnel and took refuge inside of it. Days after the second explosion, Yamaguchi languished in the bomb shelter and went through hell. His hair fell out, his wounds turned gangrene, and he continuously vomited for over a week. Slowly, he recovered from his injuries and radiation exposure and went on to live a normal life. He continued to work as an engineer for Mitsubishi and fathered 2 daughters with his wife. After the pair of atomic attacks, Japan surrendered, bringing World War II to an end. Tsutomu Yamaguchi did not talk about his experience in Hiroshima and Nagasaki until the 2000s. He wrote poetry to deal with his feelings on the subject. His memoir became part of the anti-atomic weapons movement, and he spoke in front of the United Nations about nuclear disarmament. Although he is not the only person to claim to have survived both attacks, he is the only official person to be recognized by the Japanese government for surviving both the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was given that distinction in 2009 and was named Twice Bombed Person. Unfortunately, his celebration was short-lived. In 2009, he learned that he was dying of stomach cancer. On January 4, 2010, Tsutomu Yamaguchi died at the age of 93. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.